When we think of titans, we imagine myths and legends. But back millions of years ago, titans were real. Argentina used to be the home to some of the largest land-dwelling animals. Amongst them stands one of the biggest, Patagotitan mayorum. This was a creature so massive it still challenges our understanding of life on our planet and what Mother Nature is really capable of. Join me on a journey of a complete reconstruction of Patagotitan, taking reference from one of the best fossil records that we have of any titanosaur and brought into a highly detailed, functional 3D model. Capturing a 70-ton giant isn't an easy feat. To achieve a sense of scale and realism, I use a wide array of free and paid tools. I'll be focusing on anatomically correct blockouts, believable detail inspired by real-life animals, and utilizing texturing techniques to reach new level of fidelity. So let's break down the technical workflow that made this colossal project possible. The very beginning of the process requires quite a bit of precision, as I properly scale the reference brought into Blender to fit the scale of real counterpart of this animal. But there's also some space for messiness or mess, as the blockout isn't about being perfect, but about being roughly in the ballpark. I try to be versatile with all my tools. I use curves as well as just regular sculpting, as you've seen I did for the torso. In the curves tool, I can just use vertices to control the width of the curve. Also, I try to introduce a little bit of anatomy, as here the big balls are basically just deltoids. For the limbs, as per usual, I just put down the vertices and add skin modifier, which allows me to work with these blob-like structures that are actually perfect and really fitting for most cases. Now, for the head I want to have a lot of control, so I just use basic sculpting, and the head is quite unusual, so I'm just not used to working on sauropods. Now for the end part of the limbs, which are hands, I guess. I create hoof-like structures with more basic box modeling. Same goes for the back feet, but here to add the fingers, which are important component of the limb, I actually switched to subdivision modeling, as I need a bit more resolution to achieve the shape. Also, the claws really remind me of a turtle for some reason, but I really enjoyed it, so I've over-exaggerated them. And now, before jumping into sculpting of anatomy, I try to refine the previous blockout and actually block out the breasts, because they're quite a complex shape, so I try to make my work as easy as possible early on, which is actually a very good thing to do. Now, when it comes to the anatomy, I use just one graph by Matt Dempsey, really, and I use Draw Sharp for the most part, as it allows me to draw the lines, and then later on I can refine them with clay strips. To not mess up the lines of the muscles, I stabilize the stroke, because otherwise it will just look very wrong. The great thing about anatomy is once you learn the basics, you can apply the principles to almost all animals. Now, to give proper volume to the muscles, I also use masking. For the head, I try to exaggerate at first the skeletal structure underneath, so that later on I can just work from there and I have a pretty good foundation when I want to detail the head. And at the end, I create the end part. As the time spent on the project increases, I add more and more details, which are teeth and finding the right balance between the volumes of the muscles and adding fat pads to make the animal feel believable. But then something changes. I export the model into Zbrush to achieve more detail. So after viewing the model in a different matcap, I couldn't help myself but further refine the model, adding striations, which are just byproduct of animals having muscle fibers. To avoid a crochet look, I smooth out the whole model. Now, I actually rushed the detailing part a bit, and I have to tell you, I created a whole mess and I had to go back a few hours just to start with a clean card, so just wanted to tell you that this happens. To add the cleaner version of wrinkles, I basically modified the standard brush with a bit of gravity and one step of smoothness. I also use layers, which is really great. I'm gonna tell you about it a bit more. So, same here as with my previous models, I'm adding the wrinkles in the areas that have the most stretching and squashing as the animal moves. To improve the believability, I also use another layer to exaggerate some areas that would have a bit more of squash, just using this soft GeoBrush. The cool thing about it, you can just switch between layers, hide them, increase their strength or decrease their strength. The thing about sauropods is to add quite a lot of wrinkles, but really small ones. Also add one more layer, which is just me adding alphas, following the general flow that was established along the way. As the final detail, I've decided to add spikes running along the lateral of the sauropod's body. After a few hours of improvement, I get this result, which I'm pretty happy about. The big guy finally returns home to Blender, just to be decimated. And the whole point of it is to reduce the poly count for the retopology to become a bit easier on my PC. I begin by putting down the contour lines, which are a part of the tools of the toolkit from Retopology 3. It's very useful for these tubular shapes such as tail and neck. The whole retopology just revolves first about establishing the main loops. Here, actually a pretty cool thing is to do loop for this floppy part. If it was to animate it or posed, it comes in handy. Obviously, you need a loop for the whole thigh. Already what I'm thinking about is the UV unwrapping. Contour tools also come in handy for the limbs, speed up the process so much. In order to connect loops, sometimes it's better to leave Retopology, just bridge them, add loop cuts and relax. And the most mundane part, in my opinion, was doing spikes. Every single time, just a loop consisting of 6 edges, just many times. Then I use contours to fill the whole shape of the spike, and then in edit mode I just extrude and close the gaps. And the most challenging, in my opinion, is just thinking of the whole topology holistically. How would things connect? Because just doing the spikes is just boring, but here you need to think of it as a puzzle. Once established the most of the topology, I just connect the edges, add loop cuts, and I got a ready retopologized leg. If there was one thing you had to know about me, is that I like challenges. So I like to start with the most difficult things, so that later on the easier tasks feel nice. The head is most likely one of the hardest ones. The thing right after the head are the endings of limbs, which require quite a bit of focus. Here for the sauropods, it wasn't actually that horrible. The back feet were a bit more difficult because I had to run loops going around the digits, which was a bit challenging but wasn't bad. Then the soles of the limbs were closed with grid fill. I was pretty happy with the progress. I thought I was done with all of majority of the hardest thing. But I'm gonna spoil it for you, it actually wasn't. There was a bunch of puzzle solving, and actually I decided that I will do every single spike by hand, and then I ran into this. And the roadblock, I couldn't overcome it. There was a bug that was just not allowing me to enter Retopology. But I managed to solve it, and I didn't give up. That meant also I have to go back, like a lot, and deal with new techniques. Very dense geometry, nothing I've ever had to deal with before, and this, whatever the heck that was. I've had to accept that the stuff I procrastinated cannot be ignored. Was it painful and agonizing? Yes. Did I achieve my most pristine topology yet? Yes. A journey of 1,000 UV unwraps begins with a single seam. Since I've put a lot of time on retopology, UV unwrapping is done pretty swiftly and fast. The major thing here is to follow the loops that were previously established during the retopology, and I did it well, so everything seems to be coming along nicely. Also, putting UV seams on spikes and also cut down the torso in half. I have to do seams for teeth and even more spikes. Not all of them, but the major ones, yes. Once I'm happy with the work, I check out the result to see if there's any stretching. I apply a UV grid material to check on the mesh if there is any stretching. It seems like I'm good. Then I create a custom image with multiple maps. So it's time to UV map now. UV mapping at its essence is pretty relaxing because it just revolves simply about putting flattened topology on top of map or multiple maps, as you can see right here. It can be pretty mundane at times, especially when putting down things such as teeth. It just rows upon rows of pretty much looking same objects, and I have to do it in a rather logical way. If there was a person trying to decode this, it has to be readable. For the neck, I just do it in the logical way, but I decide maybe all of the neck could fit in one tile, and it seems I was actually right, so sometimes it's worth to experiment around. Also, I put everything in a rather mirrored way, so once again it has decent readability. Then I also add colors per every tile so I can understand what's happening a bit better, also on the 2D and 3D plane. And then the bane of my existence, spikes, I try to arrange them in a way that's linear, I guess, and then just in rows. On the other hand, the front limbs have quite a lot of space on their own tile, we cannot help it. I decide to cut the back part in half so that it can fit in one tile, and it actually works. It is pretty loaded with everything, especially with spikes, but I managed to overcome this issue because everything fits just perfectly. Is it readable? Probably not, but it exists. Then the limbs, I didn't know how to do that, so I decided to do the tail, which is very simple, and then I got enlightened and I found a way how to do it. I had to put the limbs onto separate tiles, putting it in the most logical way once again, and it's the last time I have to deal with spikes, and thank God for this. So in this way, I got a pretty clean UV map, readable, optimized maybe, but it just works. I come back to ZBrush to deal with some unfinished business, which means I need to do some details, especially on those claws, adding those keratin details, and something I've done off camera was reprojecting the high poly onto low poly. For some reason the face and the head was poorly detailed, so I had to do a lot of work, such as improving the facial anatomy, adding some general face wrinkles, and creasing a bunch of edges. Here adding some skin detail, general skin detail, improving wrinkles, and what I'm doing here is pretty cool. I mask out the inside of mouth and use a noise brush to fake gum effect or that soft tissue inside of mouth. So the part that you probably came here is scales. I use a bunch of VDMs, like batches of scales, so it means that I don't need to do everything by hand. And obviously I store morph targets to basically make overlap of scales impossible. I like to mask out some areas, but not all of them. Here I am using my new VDMs, which are not out yet, so just a teaser of them right here because they're not finished. So yeah, it's just trying to think in detail and holistically how everything connects, just using a bunch of different types to shake things around. Once done with the face, I jump into feet, because the method that I'm going to show you does not cooperate well in those areas. There will be stretch, here the stretch is minimized. So here what I do, I mask out the tail, and all I do is press noise, and immediately I get a bunch of scales that are non-overlapping. I love this method. It's not that simple, obviously you need to mess around with some settings, but and you need to have a seamless alpha, and excuse the example area, but you can just mask out and the scales immediately appear. Same stuff for the neck. I mask out the neck, invert mask, and cover up the spikes because I don't want them to have any scales on top of them. As I said before, I need to think holistically, so I need to connect the head area with the neck area, so there's a bit of doubling with that. Next up, to avoid that very uniform look, probably you noticed that, I mask out the major muscle groups and I project the alpha there to mess around with different sizes of scales, because that is what breaks that super uniform look. I've tried doing it for every single wrinkle, but I gave up because it's too much work. To fill those areas in between, I use VDMs, which works alright. Yeah, that floppy part needs to have smaller scales. I've tried also using this spotlight tool to fill areas that were untouched by noise, but it doesn't work too well, so I gave up on it. Just wanted to tell you that it is a possibility. So I come back to this method, mask out these big chunks of skin and project alpha. One thing I want to tell you about is Morph Brush. So since we have stored Morph Target, Morph Brush basically just turns these areas that were affected into the previous state, so you can mess around with details without worrying too much about messing up. Before jumping into another or the next process, I try to bake out normals to have a better idea of details inside of Blender. So I load in high poly and nothing happens. Then suddenly I see a little teeny tiny man. So it means I have to come back to Blender to fix the scale. So that worked. I just select the tiles that I want to bake out normals and I press bake. Then I inspect some areas and it seems there are some issues, so I need to get back to ZBrush, but I'll save you that and let's jump into rigging. After spawning an armature, it's really important not to rotate the bone on the Z-axis, because this way you will mess up badly. After the root bone, I bring in a hip bone and extrude backwards for the tail. I try to follow this rule of 5 vertebrae per one bone, and it simulates properly the range of motion. As I extrude forwards, I run into a small issue because 5 vertebrae per neck doesn't work well because sauropods had absolutely huge vertebrae. I extrude one bone for the head and one for the jaw. It's important to keep the back joint of the bone in the hinge point of the jaw. I mask out the premaxilla because there is some issue in the jaw open close mechanics, so I mask it out, use grab brush, and then it fixes the issue. For the limbs, it's pretty simple. I just duplicate one bone and extrude it all the way down, rinse and repeat for the back limb. It's pretty easy because I don't need to add bones for the fingers. I take a second to appreciate the size of this animal. It would roam the same earth and drink the same water as we do today. Pretty crazy. Okay, enough glazing. It's time for weight paint. It's important to check the weight paint option and turn on 0 weights to all and fall off to constant. This way you will see all of the influence painted. Okay, so I begin with the hip bone and draw a pant-like shape. Then I proceed to the tail area and just paint roughly where I would imagine and expect the influence of the bone to be. You don't need to be extremely precise. The main thing is to paint everything and don't leave any black spots to be visible. There's no like huge philosophy about anything I'm doing here, so just as I said, trying to be precise, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. Then I try to slightly polish this area, especially around the spikes, and as you can see it's pretty rough, so I turn off wireframe outline and change fall off to smooth. I lock all of the bones and just unlock 2 of these, which I want to work on the transition between these 2 bones, so mostly I'll be using a blur tool or just holding shift and left click. It's pretty good habit to check the bones and their influence and how the rotation works and how the movement works. For the tail bones, I try to draw the influence of one bone that is in the middle to have influence slightly over the bone next to bones next to it, if that makes sense. Okay, seems like the Patagotitan can whip some Carcharodontosaurids. Then it's just a matter of polishing and polishing, and you want to have really smooth weights as it applies to almost all of the creatures. The head area, it has to be rather sharp, but not too sharp, and obviously you don't want to have these issues that I have created here, which lower jaw having influence over the teeth of the upper jaw. And after my most boring hour of my life, I get a pretty good result. Before jumping into Substance Painter, I have decided that I will use this free 2D drawing software named Krita. And you might be asking, what did I use it for? Well, I used this to create not 1, not 2, but 3 different skin concept arts. But why in 2D you have Substance Painter? You can see what's happening. This is another valid question, but 2D is way more forgiving. All the mistakes that you're making just cost you less time, and as everyone knows, time is money. You may go as crazy as you want. You can just pick and choose the things that you like and delete those that you do not like or erase them. This is the concept that I have chosen for the Patagotitan, which was highly inspired by marine iguana. So here I am adding a curvature layer, which is a must in my opinion for all dinosaur textures. It just really makes the scales pop. Here I create folders for every major part that will be masked out, such as teeth, inside of the mouth, etc, etc. I believe you can read. So this is in my opinion, a pretty good way of organizing. You basically paint the masks and then later you can reference them and you do not get lost so easily, because believe me, you can get lost very, very fast, and you will see that. Here I am blocking out the main color pattern. It's very similar to sculpting in that regard, because you first block out and then secondary forms. So here I am doing more of a base sculpt, similar to the concept, yes, once again. Here I am duplicating the green pattern, make it peachy, and erasing the peach to make the green color pop from underneath. I add a dark fill with gradient generator, which is a pretty hefty addition to texturing. I also add a bright green and create secondary forms for the peach colors. I add some noise and then another secondary color, darker one, to make things more interesting. Then I pay some attention to claws to make them feel more lifelike, and I play a bit with roughness, as you will see. I add a white color based on an anchor point of the green color, and then I just create a paint layer to erase the stuff that I do not want to have, and this is the result. Then it's time to move on to the inside of mouth. In my opinion, it's a really fun process. Here I'm trying to utilize curvature, but it feels very, very sharp. So I add some grunges procedural colors on top of the mask, and I add grunge to the curvature, which seems to be the answer. Yeah, definitely play around with roughness. It really can change things around. I add a brighter color for underbelly, and I go back because I hated how the peach has been created. It was like part on top of green, part underneath green. So I just start over, add a bit more aggressive color, which was a good decision in my opinion. And I add ambient occlusion, which took forever to bake, but it's so worth it. And then I add slight variations to the black color, like some reds, greens, to shake things around. So in my opinion, texturing is really fun. It can get complex really quickly, but I think I'm starting to understand what's up with Substance Painter. So as the final step, I am just adding a more interesting pattern to a part of the pattern. I return to Blender one more time. It is about time to put all of the puzzle pieces together, which means textures, I need to set them into UDIMs, and I proceed to decide upon the final pose of the Patagotitan. This one was actually really goofy, so I've decided to scrape it, and then I play around with composition. To improve the whole believability of the scene, I introduce a bunch of assets from Botanic add-on for Blender. In order to up the realism, I decided to add some running rivers, since the dinosaur would live in Cretaceous floodplains. And then it's finally time to hit render. Seems it's the end. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to subscribe if you found this video useful and fun to watch. And yeah, I'd like to also take a moment to thank my friends for helping out, sharing feedback and so on. Alright, see ya.